Welcome to Uprising, Glenn Greenwald.
Great to be with you.
Now, I want to start out talking about this notion of journalism before we even get to Snowden and the NSA in your book that you've really come to symbolize in the mainstream media, which is this idea that journalists who are the objective ones, the ones who can keep their own personal bias out of things, are the real journalists. And yet you have people like Kristof, right, who writes supposedly from his heart, but you don't see mainstream media criticizing somebody like him. How do you respond to this, what seems like a bit of a double standard?
I think in the Nicholas Kristof case, it's a little bit of a distraction just because he does write on the opinion pages. So they would say that he's not actually a reporter. He's an opinion writer and is paid to express his opinion. And their general objection is when you purport to actually report on things, that somehow if you fuse your opinions into it, that makes it illegitimate. And there's a lot of things to say about that, beginning with the fact that, you're right, opinion reporters write columns that break news all the time, including people like Nicholas Kristof and lots of other people who express their opinions continuously. But there's two things I would say about it. One is that there's this deception at the heart of this claim, which is that the idea of journalism has always been about this kind of studied objectivity and keeping your opinions out. In reality, if you go back and look at what journalism was like when the country was founded and a free press was guaranteed in the Constitution, and for several centuries even previously, journalism has been this form of crusading journalism with highly opinionated people using journalism as a tool to achieve certain social ends. It wasn't this profession of people working for corporations. It was a way that citizens could hold people in power accountable through writing about them, through publicizing what it is they're doing. So journalism has always been this kind of opinion-based, passion-driven activity. It's only in the 1950s and 60s when corporations began buying up media outlets and they imposed this kind of boring, soulless corporate model that says that journalists have to pretend not to have any opinions. And it's a very kind of new and I think corrupting model. It's really what has made journalism impotent and boring and increasingly irrelevant. The other thing about it is, the other mythology about it is that human beings can never be objective. We are not objective creatures. We don't view the world the way computers view the world. We all have extremely subjective biases through which we view all external events, whether it be cultural or socioeconomic or political or ideological. And so to me, the question is not, are you a journalist who keeps your opinions out of things, or are you one that keeps your opinions in things? Because none of them keep their opinions out of anything. The question is, are you a journalist who is honest with your readers about the assumptions that you're embracing, or do you try and deceive your readers into believing that you rise above the human condition?
Right. The other thing is that, of course, our journalists in mainstream news today try very hard to isolate pieces of news into small boxes that don't fit into the larger pattern. Context is often missing. Patterns are often missing. And of course, it can be dangerous to draw patterns because then you can sometimes be wrong. But what do you make of this, the fact that mainstream journalism really helps to turn news into these unrelated pieces of reductive information?
I think it's deliberate. I think it's a byproduct of exactly what I was just talking about, which is this highly ideological, subjective way of looking at the world that's just masquerading under the pretense of objectivity. So, for example, if there's a drone strike in Pakistan, the New York Times will always quote senior U.S. officials or Pakistani officials claiming that the drone strikes killed suspected militants, but will never quote people who live in the region or other critics saying that no, actually it's civilians that were killed. They look at that event from a very particularized and consistent perspective. They look at the world through the eyes of American political officials. That's what they did in the Iraq War. That's what they do continuously. If you look at people who are quoted on The Economy, you'll see Wall Street executives or The Economist who work at big universities, and almost never people who are actually affected by the economy. So there's these constant choices that journalists make all the time about which voices to give prominence to, which ones to exclude, which ones to ignore, and then ways of looking at the world, what kinds of context these events fit into. And those choices are all highly subjective and ideological, and they make them all the time while pretending that they don't.
Right, and by the same token, then government sources are given a much greater importance. And as you pointed out in the talk that you gave in Los Angeles, the standard approach to treating whistleblowers, people who speak out, is to try to tear them down personally and to create this bizarre profile of them psychologically. And I'm wondering if you see what has happened. You brought up Julian Assange, who is an interesting case. And, certainly people have said, even on the left, that he has this weird cult of personality built around him. And I don't really care about discussing that aspect of it. But at the same time, when we do talk about those who are breaking the news, we do talk about their personality. You talk about Edward Snowden's unassuming personality. It does, at some level, become important what people's personal motivations are, doesn't it?
I mean, it can and it can. And to me, the question is, does it get applied consistently? So, of course, there are people on the left whose work we admire and respect, whether it be WikiLeaks or other people, who have serious personality defects. We're all human beings and are highly imperfect. But to me, the issue is if you look at the kinds of microscopes under which people who dissent or who blow the whistle are subjected to, you would never see the similar kinds of personality analysis being applied to, say, top U.S. generals or powerful senators or Wall Street executives who are just treated as these respectable figures. It's a very kind of one-sided approach that clearly, again, has a very subjective bias to it. But the other thing I would say about this kind of double standard is if you look, for example, at James Clapper, who's President Obama's senior national security official, he got caught lying to Congress. Everybody knows he was lying to Congress about the NSA before we were able to do our revelations. That's a felony every bit as much as what Edward Snowden is accused of having committed. And yet you see these media figures all the time saying that Edward Snowden should man up, is their phrase, and come back and face the music and go to prison. But you never hear any of them saying that about James Clapper. Not a single prominent media official has ever said that James Clapper should be prosecuted the way Edward Snowden is. And this is the kind of lack of objectivity that I'm talking about, this kind of one-sided approach to treating whistleblowers and dissidents in a way that powerful people are never treated. And
you haven't been immune from this treatment as well. Michael Kinsley's review of your book called you a self-righteous sourpuss.
Yeah, I mean, and again, you would never hear language like that from anybody who's sort of in respectable Washington circles. I mean, the more amazing thing about that review, besides these sort of playground adolescent taunts about me, was that he actually said in this review that we have this world in which we need to keep things secret, and somebody needs to decide which things should be secret and which things should be published. And he literally said that I don't think journalists or Glenn Greenwald, people like Glenn Greenwald, should be making this decision. In the world in which we live, it's the government that must decide. The government that must decide what gets published. And not only did the New York Times publish that call for the government to be the sole decider of what we learn about, but all kinds of American journalists cheered that review because that is indicative of how even the objective ones, especially the self-proclaimed objective ones, view the world through this loyalty to the U.S. government.
And then you and your team won the Pulitzer Prize. Now, do you see this as vindication against these vehement criticisms?
Sure, of course. I mean, the journalism that we did over the last year won not only the Pulitzer, but pretty much every single major journalism award in the West. And so, these awards were given by journalists. And I think that's important to note, too, is that although a lot of the attacks on the journalism we were doing were led by other journalists who even were the ones who called for our criminalization and prosecution, which is a pretty amazing propaganda feat that the U.S. government can get journalists of all people to take the lead in calling for the criminalization of journalism. We did have a lot of support among journalists all over the world for the work that we were doing, and obviously those awards reflect that.
Right. Then you have the case of James Risen, and you write about him briefly in your book. I mean, his case is different from yours, obviously. He's trying to protect one of his sources. Edward Snowden decided to out himself, and I'm wondering if Snowden hadn't made that decision, if you might have found yourself in the position that Risen is now.
No question. I mean, had we been able to do this extraordinarily, clearly the biggest and most important leak in national security history, they would have been obsessed with finding the identity of our source and unquestionably would have gone after the reporters. I mean, that is one of the facts of political life in the United States, is that the Obama administration has waged the most aggressive and the most vindictive war in the news-gathering process compared with any other prior presidency, including Richard Nixon or George Bush.
So, in a way, Snowden gave up his freedom for yours. I mean, I hate to put it that way, but you're able to move around freely. You've been on book tour, and I'm sure you're being watched, and you're being watched, but at the same time, no one's coming after you with handcuffs. And Snowden is stuck in Russia, and does that bother you?
Well, I mean, there's always this differential treatment between sources and journalists because sources are people in the government who have the specific legal obligation not to disclose things, whereas journalists have been recognized as having this First Amendment privilege. So even in the Risen case, his source, Jeffrey Sterling, or his alleged source, Jeffrey Sterling, is being prosecuted with multiple felony counts, but nobody's prosecuting James Risen for having published it. You always get this distinction between the source and, in the Pentagon Papers case, Daniel Ellsworth was prosecuted, but the New York Times wasn't. That's what makes Snowden's choice so heroic, is that he knew exactly what he was getting himself into and sought it out, really ran into it instead of running away from it. But yeah, I do think you hit on the most crucial question, which is why is a whistleblower who starts a debate that even the President of the United States says is making us stronger as a country, facing multiple decades in prison if he returns to his own country? He really deserves a parade of gratitude for what he allowed us to know about what our government is doing.
Now, I want to ask you a little bit about the repercussions legally as well as in the public. We've just heard that the House of Representatives passed another amendment to try to curb the warrantless surveillance of communications of Americans, and also to try to outlaw the installing of backdoor hardware and software. It's unclear and probably unlikely that it would actually turn into law given the Senate and President Obama. But you've said that we shouldn't really be relying on the halls of Congress for change or to see the change originating there necessarily. Yet this is the second attempt by the House. There are enough people in Congress, or at least a significant number, who are quite upset, aren't they?
There's definitely a really interesting and serious bipartisan coalition that has been created around this issue. If you look at the first attempt 6 months ago or so to defund the NSA's domestic metadata collection program, just the fact that even got to the floor of the House by itself is extraordinary. The idea that there could be a bill to defund a major counterterrorism program in the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks is itself extraordinary, and it almost passed. And what was most interesting about it was the coalition that supported it. The two primary co-sponsors were John Conyers, the very liberal 25-term African-American congressman from Detroit, and then Justin Amash, this 32-year-old Tea Party Republican, also from Michigan, but from a much different kind of district. And then there were Republicans and Democrats across the spectrum who banded together to support the bill. The only reason why that bill didn't pass, to defund the NSA, was because the White House, Nancy Pelosi, and John Boehner, the sort of establishment from both parties, banded together and whipped enough votes against the bill at the last minute and defeated it by 7 votes. So that's the issue. You're right. There's a lot of outsider pressure in Congress and in the both political parties to try and limit the NSA. But at the end of the day, the establishment wings of both political parties, and especially the national security state, are still more powerful and can block these kinds of outbursts. That's what they look at them as. It's sort of, okay, you got that out of your system, you voted in the House, this bill will never pass.
Right. Why do you think Snowden's revelations stuck so deeply when you have had previous whistleblowers like William Binney, who brought up some aspects of the NSA surveillance? What was it about Snowden's trove of documents that struck a chord where previous whistleblowers weren't able to?
I think there were two aspects to it. One is the fact that I really do believe that people in general hold media institutions, like all public institutions in the United States, in such low esteem that if they read something that they're being told about and can't see the evidence for it themselves, they just treat it with a great deal of skepticism. They just essentially don't believe it. And so there's a massive difference between having somebody come forward to a newspaper and make claims about what the NSA is doing, like William Binney or Russell Tice or prior NSA whistleblowers, versus saying, we have the NSA's secret documents that you were never supposed to see that you can just read for yourself and don't have to take our word for it. People are really convinced when they see the things that they know that they were never supposed to see. The other aspect of it is that, may be lamentable and may be unfortunate, but is nonetheless true, is that if you are a journalist or if you're an activist or if you're a political sort of advocate of any kind, you need to accept the fact that engaging the public is a really important part of what you're doing, and sometimes that takes some thought about how to keep them interested, how to make things entertaining and dramatic. And I think the audacity of what Snowden did, the fact that it involved Hong Kong and this flight to Moscow and this attempt to get him and this international intrigue and spycraft and all this drama kept people really interested in the story, and that enabled us to sort of exploit that public interest to focus their attention on the substance of the revelations.
But you and The Guardian had a very, it seems, deliberate strategy as well in your reporting of this. And this goes back to the issue of creating patterns, where you didn't just throw it out all at once as one or two big stories. You have very systematically reported on every piece of this and tantalizingly told the public there's more to come. You haven't seen the worst of it.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely felt like part of my job as a journalist working on this story was to not only just get the information out, but to think about how to get it out in a way that would have the greatest impact, that would keep the public interested, that would inform them. I mean, it would have been really easy for me to just churn it all out. But, one of the things I realized when I was in Hong Kong, that those first 5 days we produced 5 straight stories in a row. And we had even allies of civil liberties who work on these issues every day for years saying to us, look, this stuff is too complicated. We can't even keep up with the disclosures at this rate. You need to slow down and let them process and let the kinds of reaction unfold. And I learned that lesson in that first week that, each of these stories was so powerful that to just pile them all up on one another is essentially to suffocate them all. And that I wanted to be very kind of selective and strategic about how I did the stories. And I think the other benefit was I knew the government had no idea what we had. And so many times they would come out and make claims in response to one of our stories that I could then the next week prove was actually a lie by publishing additional documents. And so I didn't want to give away that strategic advantage that I knew the documents that we had, but they didn't know. But a big part of it is definitely keeping the public interested with this sort of drama. You have to treat it a little bit as a show that people watch. I think it's really self-indulgent to say, I'm above these questions of public interest and keeping the public interest. I'm just going to be a journalist and put the information out there. I've worked for a long time on these issues, and so the opportunity to make people pay attention was one I wasn't going to give up.
In your talk, you talked about this very important issue of how people think of privacy themselves as they have now come to the realization that they are being watched. And this idea that we tend to control our own behavior and suppress our own dissent. All I could think about was 1984, Orwell's 1984. I mean, that pliant public where then the only people who flaunt any rules are supposedly the troublemakers, the criminals among us. It's just a very grim and bleak future/present. Do you think of Orwell?
Well, the funny thing is, I actually, everyone knows 1994. We all read it in high school, and it's sort of the symbol of the rogue, menacing surveillance state. And it's become almost a cliche. But, Orwell was brilliant, and it was a critical book. And so I actually went back and read it in light of the work I was doing. And the thing that surprised me the most was I had always remembered this kind of the ubiquity of the surveillance, which was we have a monitor in every home and in every single room of every home constantly watching every single person. So that a lot of people say, well, we're not like 1984 because not every single one of our emails is being read or every one of our calls are being listened to because nobody can possibly be doing all that. And the thing is, if you go and read the way Orwell described the surveillance state, the monitors that were in people's home, he said, nobody actually knew whether they were being watched at all times. In fact, they didn't even know if they were ever being watched. The key to the social control was the possibility that they could be watched at any time, which meant that they had to assume that they were always being watched and therefore act accordingly, meaning act with this sort of compliant, conformist, just sort of submission. And that, I think, is the main impact of a surveillance state. You don't have to read a person's email, every single email, and listen to every one of their telephone calls. Just the mere knowledge that you've created this massive surveillance system puts them in the mindset that they're capable of being watched at any time. And that by itself is enough to control their behavior.
Do you find that you've maybe changed your own behavior since these revelations, you got these documents from Snowden?
Sure. In large part because I know that my communications are the target of all kinds of surveillance. In the lawsuit that was brought by my partner, David Miranda, alleging that the British government broke the law and detaining him under terrorism law for 11 hours in Heathrow Airport, the British government had to justify their detention of him, and they filed documents making conclusively clear that they were targeting his or mine or the Guardian, my colleagues at the Guardian's emails and telephone calls. And so, I won't use the telephone for anything but the most banal communications. David and I are careful about what we say. in places that could easily be monitored, including even our own house or our cars. And so, I encrypt all of my emails very heavily. And so, this idea that you can be watched and monitored, and probably are, can be very kind of suffocating in its own way.
Yeah. And then finally, the issue of government surveillance is one thing, but it also works hand in hand with corporate surveillance. The government relies on corporations like Google and Facebook and Twitter to collect data, and yet companies like Google say that they're interested in protecting people's privacy because they realize they'll lose customers otherwise. That Google was involved in the Reset the Net campaign recently. But corporate surveillance, which is usually predicated on obviously profits and people buying stuff, is it just as insidious? Is it not another parallel track of surveillance that we should also fear? It seems as though people don't care as much about corporate surveillance as they do about government surveillance.
Well, first of all, I think that there is a serious danger from corporate surveillance, but I also think that it is mythological at this point to even talk about corporate surveillance versus government surveillance as though these are two distinct entities. The reality is that in almost every single important realm, the government has essentially merged itself with the private interests that control those areas. So it's like talking about Wall Street versus the Treasury Department, when in reality Goldman Sachs is or Citibank or JP Morgan are constantly rotating in and out of these agencies, and they work hand in hand. Same with, when you talk about the intelligence community, you're not just talking about the NSA. You're talking about Booz Allen Hamilton and Google and Facebook and Verizon and Sprint and AT&T. There's really almost a merger. But there's a couple things that I would say about the difference between corporate surveillance and government surveillance, which is that when Google is collecting information about you, they're able to collect information that you are providing within the context of you using Google services. So they can know your Google searches, they can know your Gmail emails, but what they can't know are the chats that you have on Facebook or the conversations that you have on Skype, because they're only able to get the sliver of activities that you are engaged in while using their services, as opposed to the government, which is actually centralizing everything about you all in one place. So that's one big difference. And another big difference is the government just does have certain powers that corporations, even the most powerful ones, don't have. Governments can put you in a cage for the rest of your life. They can take your property. They can even kill you. And that's why if you look at the Bill of Rights, the Bill of Rights is geared toward limiting the actions of government as opposed to private actors, because we give government a monopoly on certain kinds of violence and certain kinds of coercion and force that make it uniquely dangerous.
Can I squeeze in one last question?
Sure.
Going back to the issue of journalism and how our own personal biases affect us, obviously people's own political influences influence what we write about, but don't the demographics of people also provide a filter? I mean, our newsrooms are dominated by white guys, by wealthy, generally, and older white guys, heterosexual white guys. People of color, women of color are hardly represented. That also, of course, sharply skews the news that we read. What is your hope for the new media landscape that you're now launching or have launched deeply into with the Intercept? What is your vision for how journalism should look like in an ideal world?
I mean, first of all, of course, the premise to your question is absolutely right, and it's part of what I was saying earlier, is this idea that somebody can be objective and liberate themselves from their very potent and influential experiences, including their demographics, how you grow up, who you are, the way the society reacts to you, how that shapes how you think about the world, is so mythical for exactly that reason. And I do think there's a huge lack of diversity in all sorts of ways in media. And one of the great things about the internet that makes journalism online so exciting and as a form of new media is that it opens up the kinds of people who can do far-reaching, hard-hitting journalism without having to go work for these large corporations that tend to hire the same kind of people from the same kind of places. And so, for sure, as we're building the Intercept, and I mean, we're at the very beginning stages of still doing it. We launched just to be able to have a place to do NSA reporting before we were ready, but we're now getting ready. I mean, one of the things that we vowed early on was that we wanted to be the most diverse news organization of our size in terms of demographics, because from demographic diversity comes ideological diversity, viewpoint diversity, experience diversity. It's not the only thing that produces diversity, but it's certainly a prerequisite for it. And so as we're building our team, that is definitely one of our driving goals, that we don't end up looking like or sounding like or acting like the traditional newsrooms that we're trying to sort of define ourselves as in opposition to.
Well, Glenn Greenwald, I want to thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.